everybody. Welcome back to another edition of Game Changers. I know I say I'm always excited to talk to this person, but I am beyond excited to talk to this person this morning. Andy O'Brien is joining me shortly, and we're going to talk about all the things and all the reasons why he truly is a game changer and why he was probably the original game changer way back in the day when I met him. So I'm super excited to get to nail him down today and talk to him about all the amazing things that he does and why he truly is a game changer. Stay tuned. Thank you so much for coming. I'm so excited.
No problem at all. Me too.
When I was, I've been doing this podcast with Dr. McMakin for over a year now, and we started doing it over COVID just as like a way to connect and learn and talk and share.
Yeah.
And it took off. And then people were saying, yeah, but can you talk more about like the training side and more about the PT side? So then I'm like, yeah, let's start another podcast because everybody has a podcast right now.
Of course.
But yeah, it's been so much fun. And selfishly, I've been choosing people that I just like to talk to for an hour. So
yeah, totally.
We're finally making it happen. I'm super, I've got 2 pages of lists here to get through. So
awesome.
I'll just have you start. I'm going to have you introduce yourself. I know who you are. Most of us know who you are, but you're Andy O'Brien.
Yeah, no problem. I'm Andy O'Brien, and I've been, I guess, working in pro sports or elite sports for a little over 25 years now. So it's been a long time, and have, had sort of a windy road in terms of the different elements of that career. I've worked primarily as a strength and conditioning coach, but then, grew a private business, also worked with a couple of pro teams, and then started working in more of a leadership role with those sports teams. And then that started to evolve into, helping teams identify talent and identify infrastructure, roles, responsibilities, how people talk to each other, how they communicate to each other, and started to develop a little expertise in helping organizations solve those problems. But really it kind of just boils down to being a coach, and that's what I love to do. And I think that's still kind of the roots of it all.
And you played sports growing up?
Yeah, I did. Yeah. I grew up in an era and in a small town where everybody was multi-sport athletes. So, you played 5 or 6 sports and you competed against all the same people in all those different sports. So, you would see them in track and field, and then you'd see the same people playing hockey and playing baseball, playing soccer. So yeah, that's how I did it. It was more multi-sport, never phenomenal at one particular thing, but pretty good at a variety of things.
We're going to talk about this later, about specialization versus generalization, because it's a topic I'm very passionate about. I feel very strongly with one way about it. I feel like I'm not the norm when it comes to it. So we will circle back to that eventually. But how did you, obviously being an athlete, I think a lot of the greatest coaches and therapists and trainers were once athletes. I think that's kind of what made them good, is that inherent passion to get better, and being a good teammate always makes you want to help others improve. So why did you get into coaching? Like why this field?
It's a really good question. Ultimately, this sounds a little bit gimmicky, but when I was 7 years old, I saw the movie Rocky IV. And for those that haven't seen the movie, there's a lot of people that haven't seen that movie now because it's going back a long time. But ultimately it was Rocky, this American that had very little training, very little technical abilities or talent, that had just sort of made a career for himself on just will and determination. And those movies always highlighted the training montage, which essentially summarized just this, how far you can take yourself with will and determination. And even as an underdog, if you want something, you can achieve it. And on the other side, in this particular version of the Rockies, you had the Russians, who had all of this technology and sophistication, and they had all of these doctors ultimately figuring out how to make the perfect human physical specimen. And the polarity of those two boxers that were facing each other in that movie was really interesting to me. How you could have these two totally different approaches, but both of which could be really successful. And it was in many ways the training montage in that movie was just really cool. The feeling that you get when you have a goal ahead of you and you just start applying yourself, and you have in your mind this picture of where you want to go. And so I was always interested in housing those two things and seeing what a philosophy would be like. And at that time I was pretty young, but I always really enjoyed training for my own sports, because it reminded me of that training montage, and it allowed me to connect, I think, with my own athletics in that way. And then was also interested in the sophistication side of it. How can I find the right program, or how can I learn a new technique? At that time, there wasn't a lot of access to technology, but what technology might be out there that I could potentially use? And so it really got me thinking about my own training. And I think that's how it all started.
It's funny. So many people I've talked to, different trainers, everybody has their own sort of unique spin, what makes them special, what makes them great. And when I think about you, and I think about knowing, and it's so funny, I had this conversation when I had Peter Twist on, and I was trying to figure out how long I've known Peter. And I want to say like 5-10 years in my brain, but we had gone back over 20 years because
Wow.
we're just old. But part of, and then talking to Lauren Goldenberg, it was the same thing. Like some people have been in the industry for so long. And I think if you have been, especially with professional sports, you have to learn to kind of blur the lines of reinventing yourself, staying current, but sticking to what makes you fundamentally successful. So when I think about you and why you're a game changer and why you're who you are, I think you've always sort of embodied this holistic approach to training more so than any other trainer I've ever talked to. You've been pivotal at seeing the big picture and incorporating that with athletes. And so going back to your fundamentals of Rocky, I think that paradox is actually totally embodies what you do, because you have these scientific objective measures that you use that are not woo-woo or hokey, but yet you also blur the lines of the newest, greatest, trying to stay ahead of the curve. And I think that's probably the hardest thing in professional sports, is blurring those lines.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it, actually, because it's an art and a science, really, at the end of the day.
Right.
And it's fascinating. I was doing something one time, it was like an interview, and they were asking me a little bit about my parents and what they do. And it made me realize that there's a lot of influence there as well. So my dad was in the accounting profession. So he was a CA and he got into finance, but he was a partner in his firm, and then got involved in government. And he was known as somebody who was really, really good at taking complex things and simplifying them and explaining them to people. So he's very good with numbers. He was really good with analysis. He could really absorb things that were complicated to a lot of people, and then just lay them out in a really, really simple way. And so that sort of was his thing, was helping to sort through and problem solve, and help other people really see clarity in things that aren't overly clear initially. And my mom was a nurse, and my mom is just an empath and somebody who's extremely compassionate, and is very naturally, she naturally gravitates to people who are vulnerable and in need, and is a great supporter. And so that to me also encompasses the two polarities in training, which is just at the end of the day, this desire to truly help someone and to see in them a goal that they want to achieve, or to see in them some level of courage that they need to have to pursue what they need to pursue, and being inspired by that, and then just really wanting to be part of their support staff. I think that in essence is really what a trainer is. It's somebody who's in your corner, who's on your side, helping you get to where you need to be. And then, that ability to take these difficult things that people have, maybe they're struggling, what's worked for them in the past is no longer working for them now. I have an injury and I don't really know where to go from here. Those moments where you feel a little bit lost, and then have somebody really break that down and explain it and make it very clear so that you can gain confidence in it. I think those are really two great qualities and good coaches that I know.
I think so much to unpack in that one statement. I'll go back to the first part that you were talking about, having your parents influence. And again, that paradox of having someone who's super analytical, very factual, very objective, but what a gift that is to take something super complicated and be able to unpack it so that your athlete or your person or your client, whoever, can understand it. My last year of continuing education, what I've been really interested in is how to be a better communicator, because ultimately it doesn't matter what I know, what my experience has shown me. If I can't parlay that into my patients or clients, it's sort of lost. I think with athletes, there's this piece of where they inherently want to get better, where we don't necessarily see that with chronic pain patients or with the average person. I think that's probably a given. They're coming to see you because they want to rehab, they want to be better, they want to be faster, they want to be in their sport for a long period of time. I was having this conversation with Dr. McMakin a couple of weeks ago on our podcast, and she said, you can't want it more than the patient. And have you ever found that you're really struggling trying to get somebody better, faster, stronger, and you maybe want it more than they do?
Yeah, I think that comes up a fair bit, especially now I'm working with a sports agency and I have a team of coaches that work with me. And yeah, it comes up a lot where you have somebody that's really talented, but they haven't yet embraced or fully understood what it takes. So they haven't really developed that. And that was an interesting paradigm for me to solve, because in my career, I had never really dealt with that much because I've sort of always been limited in terms of the types of people that I can take on, because I do relatively deep dives with those people and there's a lot of customization. And so I'm just really limited in terms of my reach as a coach. And I've often found that the people that want to work with me, they're typically people that want, something more than just a box ticking, type of experience. They sort of arrive at my doorstep because they're already motivated and they're already looking to make significant change. And so I think just for happenstance, it sort of worked out that I've always worked with really highly motivated people, and I've never had to be a good motivator. But now I think I'm involved in broadening that network and helping other coaches work with athletes at all kinds of levels. And as I'm doing that, I'm definitely seeing that there's a big component of it is really teaching people. And then ultimately, they have to decide for themselves, how bad they want it.
It's funny, going back to my own upbringing. My mom was an immigrant from Germany and from Holland, genetically gifted, freak of nature, sprinter, went to the Commonwealth Games and the Pan Am Games, went to the Olympic trials with almost little training whatsoever, could just run really fast. And we were talking about that later on, what a gift that is, and also what a detriment that is versus the athletes that have to just grind and grind and grind and maybe have the genetics deck stacked against them. So when you're dealing with an athlete that potentially has certain limits, whether it's physiological, biological, structural, what are some of the ways that you're able to help coach and get around or just be realistic with those limits?
Yeah, great question. And that's such a good point. First off, how did I not know this about your mom's background? That probably explains a few things, but I'm fascinated by that and by what you said there, because I actually think some of the really, really gifted and most elite athletes are athletes who were late bloomers or who had really, really like overly difficult scenarios as young athletes, and then later they became better. So two athletes that I work with really closely are Sidney Crosby and Nathan MacKinnon. And Nathan was a late grower, like he was actually quite short growing up, and then hit a growth spurt a little bit on the late side. So he had to use his speed because he didn't have size, and he had to learn how to create space for himself. And so then when he grew, then he became a bigger player, and he's over 6'1" now. So So now he's got this incredible, blinding speed to his game that I think was a large part because of how aggressive he had to be as a skater when he didn't have that size. And Sidney Crosby, I think, can fit into that box too, because as a 14-year-old, he was playing with older players. And so he always, was playing against players that were bigger and stronger than he was. And he had to find ways to use his physicality, whether it was getting low or whether it was, hitting them at the right time, or, learning when to create physical contact, or using his mind for the game because he wasn't able to physically dominate players. And then as he grew and started playing against other players that had that same level of physicality, now he's able to dominate physically, but also has the mind for the game. And comparing that to players who were always gifted athletes, or maybe who were more physically mature than the athletes that they're playing against, they really struggle from a cognitive perspective, thinking the game, learning the game, because they've never had to. They've always been able to skate around people or use their physicality. And there's actually some pretty good evidence around this with the long-term athlete development research that was done. I think Istvan Bailey had done a fair amount of work around the disadvantages of players who are physically developed early in their maturation. But to get back to your question, I would say that I think that, to me, is, again, if you're trying to pull from a wide toolbox, there are some athletes where you have to focus on what they're doing technically, and then other athletes where you may have to just really try to inspire them. And I think that's where an athlete who maybe has the talent deck stacked against them, you have to really just inspire them. You have to build confidence in those athletes, and you have to create a belief in themselves first and foremost. So I think your style of coaching at that point in time becomes about the person and the individual, and helping them see themselves as capable. I think that's really the first step. And then once you have that, I think you kind of let the athlete, find different components that they can latch onto that really helps them build that confidence.
Confidence is just like that keyword that we keep talking about already this morning. So many times I'm seeing a lot of athletes, obviously, through their injuries. And it's funny, you'll have a bucket of them that come with so much confidence that they will rehabilitate and come back stronger. And it's funny, when you hear the backstory, those are typically the athletes that had to grind. It didn't come natural for them. It wasn't easy. Versus the athletes that when they do get injured, it is crisis mode, end of the world. And I find their return to play can be a little bit more complicated, because we get them out of pain, we get the moving range of motion, everything is getting there. But it's that fine little component at the end of confidence building that, in the process of what got them from injury to return to play. And yeah, it's super interesting. I'm reading this book right now called The Comfort Crisis.
Okay.
It's amazing. It's sort of about how it started off as the author was trying to figure out why we have so much depression and anxiety and lack of resiliency in the millennial sort of generation. And he's going back to the Clorox wiping, the snowplow parents, like trying to make things super easy. And the book is based on all this research that we need a certain amount of adversity and a little bit of trauma, but not too much trauma. We need something in our growth period. We need to do hard things. And so he's about doing these different types of challenges that are physically and mentally challenging in order for us to develop adversity and resiliency, grit, so on and so forth. So again, going back to the athletes that maybe have had it a little bit easy, and genetically, every athlete wants to just be that one, man, I wish I could just skate like that and not have to put the work in. But I think there's definitely something to be said for having to grind.
Oh, no question. Yeah, I remember. So lots of learning experiences for me in the two Stanley Cup runs that I had when I was working in Pittsburgh, and just being around a lot of great people and seeing how they operate in different moments. But one of the things that Mike Sullivan preaches all the time with that group that he has there, and that he did with the teams that we won, is the idea of being comfortable, being uncomfortable. And that there's so many ways in team sports to like maybe find an easy way to win. So you can sort of pace yourself from that standpoint, or because there's 82 games and it's such a grind physically and mentally, you can find shortcuts to get to your goal. And it can be very natural and instinctive for human beings to do that. But it's this idea that eventually it's going to be the person who can last in that state of discomfort the longest that wins that war of attrition in the playoffs. And so you have to really allow your body to get exposure to that, to the point where you feel comfortable in that environment, and that gives you that competitive advantage.
Yes. To all those things, just because I have teenagers right now, and I'm consequently seeing all of their teammates in my clinic, it is funny when some of them come in, like, everything is so hard right now. I'm like, and you try to unpack what's hard. I get it. Being 16, just by definition, is hard. But when they start talking about, I have to juggle school and relationships and, my sport. And now I'm finding you're educating these teenagers that they have to take care of themselves. So I'm going to go back to kind of like your holistic approach for a second, because like, just hearing the way that you were speaking, I was trying to think how long I've known you too, at least 10 years, but
at least, yeah.
Right. But, there is such a big message of, okay, this is what we're going to do training, but let's take a look at your diet. Let's take a look at your sleep. Let's take a look at some, hormonal problems, dietary insufficiencies, blah, blah, blah. Like, the list went on, and it can be super overwhelming for an athlete who hasn't had to maybe take care of themselves in that way. I was at a conference a couple years ago, and it was a biotensegrity model, and fascia has been on the leading edge of a lot of really cool research. For me, it's super interesting because fascia was the stuff I cut away to get at the muscle in those gross anatomy labs that I used to do. But the practitioner had somebody up on stage who had like frozen shoulder, and he did some, fascial distortion stuff. And, the person went from 90 degrees abduction to all the way up. And I was like, wow. And I was just like, kind of standing there with my arms crossed. And he came up to me, he's like, Kim, you were like the only one that wasn't like shocked or clapping. And I said, because what you did on stage is nothing but a party trick. If her range of motion doesn't last tonight, if she doesn't wake up with it tomorrow. And I think that sort of message was kind of, I'm going to ask you what the foundation of your philosophy is, but I'm just going to answer it for you. I think you've been such a proponent of looking at the big picture with athletes. And again, I know you're working with the best in the world, but is that a stumbling block sometimes when you're breaking things down for athletes, all the things that they potentially might have to tweak and change?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And that is kind of one of my big rocks, which is try to maintain a wide lens and to try to somehow, this is the art of it, is really somehow trying to balance your experience and all the previous cases that you've had with maintaining an open mind and looking at each case as a potential for learning or potential for uncovering new things that you don't know. That's really hard to do. And I think that it's very, very easy to develop a style or a technique or certain ways of doing everything, but it can also get sucked into being a hammer and everything's a nail. So you sort of have these predetermined conclusions about what's going on or what isn't, or what the solutions might be. And I've always tried to develop a big toolbox, maintain a sense of mastery about all the tools that I'm using. So make sure I understand them and know how to apply them at a deep level. And then really just start everything with a blank canvas and ask some questions and try to logically sort through that and use deductive reasoning instead of using a system. And in that way, it leaves you very open to solving a lot of problems in different ways. And I think underneath that, it's a desire to find the truth about every situation. What is the best possible solution? And that doesn't necessarily satisfy any biases that I have. It just happens to be the best possible solution for that individual at that given time. So the holistic side of it, that's been the part that I've found is the hardest to teach to a lot of my coaches. It's more of a thinking style than it is a training philosophy. It represents, in my opinion, just a level of curiosity. Great thinkers, they're very curious, and they're confident enough in what they know to be able to say, I don't know, or that didn't work. And there's just this, I think when you are a truth seeker, there is an honest accounting of the work that you're doing in a way that doesn't scare you. It excites you because there could potentially be something to learn on the other side.
I think, again, so much to unpack with that one statement. When I think of the people that I trust, who I would call, such as yourself, when I have an athlete that needs help, there's the confidence in you that if you don't know, I know you will find somebody who does know. And I would rather work and collaborate with somebody with that mindset versus the guy that knows it all. Because you can't possibly be an expert in all the things that you need to be an expert, especially when you're working with a world-class athlete. And to have the humility and, like you said, just the inherent desire to not only get your athlete better, but to get yourself better and to potentially learn something, I think is a gift, and it's necessary in professional sports. I mean, if I don't know, but I find somebody who does know, I still look like the rock star. So I don't understand like why people have so much problem with their ego in that way. I want to unpack a little bit more things here. When I started getting into FSM, I was super overwhelmed because I just thought FSM was going to be the tool that was going to help me with inflammation and help break down scar tissue. Little did I know there'd be so many frequencies for so many systems of the body. And again, I got super overwhelmed, but it piqued my interest in expanding the way I would think of not just, okay, this muscle is tight or this muscle is weak, but taking the path of how did it get tight? How did it get weak? And then really going back to other, physiological reasons, biomechanical problems, trauma, blah, 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 to help sort through it. So again, my FSM sports module is, rehab, recovery, and then performance enhancement, because I firmly believe you can't improve somebody's performance enhancements if they're not recovering properly or if they haven't rehabilitated from a previous injury. What are some of the things that you're doing, seeing, enjoying right now about rehabilitation as far as helping a muscle or helping an injury get better? Because there's a lot out there right now.
There's definitely a lot out there. I think going from the top down and reverse engineering it from the things that I think matter the most, I would say one of the big things is just the adaptability of the system of the individual. So it's really fascinating to me how, injured or not injured, I mean, even some healthy athletes can go through periods where they've got chronic inflammation, they've got immune, got brain issues. There's a lot happening there. Hormonal issues with the athlete, overtraining, sleep problems. There's a lot of different nutrition issues where an athlete shows up and you give them something that 10 other athletes respond really well to, and that athlete doesn't respond to that particular stimulus. That to me is pretty fascinating. You do see a lot of athletes that show up, for me in particular, because they've tried a lot of other things that should be working and they're not working, and they're trying to figure out why. So that sort of forces me into that path of trying to understand why they're not responding to normal things. So you get an athlete who, doesn't show up really well in terms of some basic strength. So they show up on a team and they're not testing well in some basic strength measures. And they say, oh, well, here's the problem. The athlete's not very strong. We have to improve their strength, right? But if you then rewind and say, well, tell me about your history. And they say, well, here's what I've done. These are the people I've done it with. You might see that there's actually some really highly competent, training strategies that they've been exposed to. So now the question is, okay, well, why aren't they strong after having done all of that? So maybe instead of making the same mistake and just assuming that they're going to respond really well to a basic strength program, let's see what's going on there. Why is there no adaptation happening? So I think that, like, really to kind of broadly answer the questions, I think it's asking the question why and looking at how people respond to things. And very often that is, whether it's looking at biochemistry or asking questions about sleep and lifestyle, nutrition, you start looking under the hood a little bit and you see what's happening from an adaptability standpoint. But maybe something that's a little bit more tangible, I would say, is COVID was an interesting time where a lot of us had just time to do some different things. And I was working for the Penguins, but I was in Toronto when everybody was isolated, had access to my gym here, and was going every day and working on some different things, some concepts. And I'd been through a couple of rehabilitation cases prior and worked with a couple of high-level experts previous to that. And I really had spent a lot of time looking at connections of the upper body and the lower body from a tensegrity model or from a fascial model, and started to look at how a shoulder or an upper limb can affect the contralateral limb on the opposite side, so how a left shoulder can affect a right hip. And so I started doing things a little bit more global and a little bit less isolated. And it's not that was a new concept for me, because I always understood it. But I think I had enough time and space to really experiment and think through that and come up with solutions that really fit. And, that was definitely a game changer for me, because I was able to create change. Athletes that had maybe hip pelvic issues, I've been really focusing on the pelvis and really focusing on what's happening there. And now I started to do overhead applications, or applications with long lines and rotational stress and multi-directional stress, exploring different planes of motion and looking at how that travels through the body in these distal lines. And so as I started to see biomechanically and from a neuromuscular and a fascial standpoint, how those things were connected and exploring them, I started to see really, really good results, and then just kind of ran with it.
That's awesome. I'm actually taking Peter Twist's fascial line training.
Oh, cool.
And Peter Twist, he was my first person that I had for many different reasons, but he was one of the first courses that I really sunk my teeth into, because everything just to me made sense from a biomechanical perspective. He was big into his hockey accelerate program back in the 90s. He had coined the term brakes. So he was talking a lot about deceleration before acceleration, and really honing in on balance and proprioception. I actually did my thesis on pelvic instabilities and using a lot of balance training with that. So I am very pelvic centric. I can't not look at someone's pelvis the second that they come in. I start there and I'll go up and down depending on what I see. I wish I could get away from that, but I can't unsee it anymore. So I think that's really interesting about the fascial line training. And like you said, it's not new. These aren't new concepts, but it's hard when we're busy practitioners to sit and play with something and really sink our teeth into it. And it's one thing, I think, to learn it, but then to apply it and then to observe the results from the applications, I think is, so COVID did a lot of messed up things, but I am grateful for all the learning that I got to do during that time period. Let's talk a little bit about recovery. Recovery to me usually boils down into two camps. That's getting an athlete to sleep better and to fuel their body better. I think those are the two main components. I don't know, I'll let you talk about recovery a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think recovery can happen in a lot of different ways. Certainly, there's a lot of different types of modalities that are in that box, but do different things. For some, it's blood flow. For some, it's a little bit more. It's a little bit more about energy, whether that's at a mitochondrial level, whether that's at a biophysical level. There's a lot of like physical applications, like FSM, like various forms of microcurrent, things like PEMF. There's a lot of different tools out there. There's tools that work on oxygenation. So there's things like everything from hyperbaric to ozone therapy to a variety of different types of things, red light therapy, compression tools, hydrotherapy. So, but I think that inevitably you can go down the roads of a lot of these different things, and ultimately you're stimulating adaptability. So I think if you look at adaptability as a thing in and of itself, and then you deep dive on, okay, what is the thing that is most likely preventing adaptation? So if it's something that's maybe the athlete is overly sympathetically dominant, they have a really difficult time with their vagus nerve and switching that back on, maybe focusing on the vagus nerve is going to be more effective than looking at things from a cellular standpoint or from an oxygenation standpoint. Right. If somebody is maybe, having issues with potentially like a cellular issue, maybe some mitochondrial issues, maybe some inflammation happening at a neuromuscular level, then things that are blood flow related or getting nutrients to that level, or even things like zone 2 cardiovascular work could be really beneficial, right? Enhancing mitochondrial function, removal of toxins could be really valuable for somebody like that that's producing a lot of toxins and having a difficult time removing it. So I think you have to look at adaptability and then think, what are the things that are maybe preventing or holding up that adaptive response? And then that might guide you a little bit from a recovery standpoint. The zone 2 work that I've mentioned, really surprisingly, I started using this a little bit more recently, I'd say probably the past 2 or 3 years. Kind of blown away at the results with a lot of pro athletes in sports like hockey that don't have this ability to fully recover just because of the games, the travel, the way that things are set up. It's like almost impossible to get that 100% recovery from game to game. Kind of impressed at these longer, slower rides that seem to be able to enhance recovery. And I know there's a handful of mechanisms by which that's happening. There's blood flows, there's a respiration component. There is an enhancement of the subsystems that are helping to recover, and whether that's at a mitochondrial level or not a red blood cell level, is a few different ways that might happen. But yeah, just getting like these superior results, and never was the type of person to want to throw someone on a bike for 40 minutes, especially when they're doing all of this other training. But actually seeing some really impressive things, and have kind of run with that and tried to create a few more solutions around that recently.
That's very interesting. Very good. I want to talk about sleep. We'll go to hockey for just, let's go to hockey for a minute, just because they do play so many games. Games are late. How are you promoting somebody to go to sleep right away when they are physically and mentally excited after playing like that? I think pro hockey's got to be one of the hardest sports to promote a consistent sleep schedule, because they're not going to bed before 10 p.m.
No question. I think that is like one of the tools. Like obviously I've seen FSM do some really, really cool things with this. But it's really just boils down to relaxation of the central nervous system. And there's ways to do that working directly on the vagus nerve. There's ways to do it through the peripheral nervous system. So by trying to create some activity at the peripheral level, it's actually sort of antagonizing the central level. You're really just trying to trigger that parasympathetic response in the individual at that time. There are some nutrients that could work really well with that. Like my magnesium cocktail that I use is a combination of magnesium threonate and magnesium bisglycinate. Bisglycinate probably working a little bit better at the peripheral level. Magnesium threonate has very good blood-brain barrier crossage, so you're working at a little bit more at the brain level. But big fan of magnesium and theanine as well. So theanine in dosages of 400 milligrams or more can have a pretty instantaneous effect on the nervous system, especially when you've got anything going on in terms of hyper-analytical thoughts. So people who tend to get in their head and they're replaying different scenarios, you want to get them using some breathing techniques or winding down techniques. Theanine can go really well with that as an adjunct therapy. So definitely with some of the nutraceuticals, I think some breathing techniques and some techniques in terms of what's happening in terms of the chatter that's going on upstairs. And then I think some of the modalities to get the body to relax and respond. And I think that can vary from individual to individual, but they can be quite powerful.
I remember when I was living in Calgary working with an Olympic athlete who had a very hard time turning off at night, and wasn't in hockey, so we couldn't blame the schedule too much on it. So we were talking about, just some basic holistic natural sleep hygiene tools, like turning the thermostat down, turning the lights down 2 hours before bed, and getting off of their phone. I think the phones are, especially for the teenagers that I work with, they're, on Facebook, and maybe not Facebook, Facebook's old apparently, like Instagram or Snap, right up until they're falling asleep. And there's been so many studies recently about how social media is conjuring up feelings of insecurity, jealousy, anxiety, depression, just impossible standards for teenagers to live up to when they're looking at the Insta filter. So the last month I've been trying to showcase some mental health strategies and just being really honest about using a therapist, using a sports psychologist, like you're talking about breathing techniques. There's so many apps out there too that can just run you through some guided meditation at night, helps with the vagus nerve. Is there anything like that you promote as far as an app or breathing or music or anything like that, taking a bubble bath?
Yeah, no question. I mean, the bath salts, I think, can be really powerful, actually. I'm a big fan of that. They can be good for inflammation, but they can be really good for relaxation of the system as well. So using things like arnica and lavender and magnesium and this high level of Epsom salt concentration can be really, really good for people that really like baths.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of really good teas out there that can work well. And I'm always cautious with certain types of herbs. Like I'm cautious with things like lemon balm and things like valerian root and California poppy and different things that could have some receptor binding activity. Those things, I'm a big believer in the importance of sleep, but I think most of the sleep experts would agree that there's still a little bit of mystery as to what specifically is happening that's creating all of this massive amount of recovery for our brain and our nervous system during sleep. And so I'm a big believer that you don't necessarily want to manipulate the receptor activity for too long during the sleep cycle. You may want to enhance sleep to a certain degree or help somebody fall asleep. But I think doing that at a minimal level and then just working on the circadian rhythms with things like exposure to natural light at the right time, sleep hygiene, so making sure you don't have electronics in your room, using things like white noise, temperature control, humidity control, using an eye mask to keep the light consistent in the room in those important sort of last 3 hours of sleep could be really important. So I think there's a lot of different ways you can approach it. And I would say it's really interesting. What you were talking about the electronics, I've seen a lot of different, this is obviously a big issue because we live in a world where, people operate on their phones or they operate on emails or tablets or whatever that might be. And it's so stimulating. And what's really fascinating is you could jump on your computer, jump on your phone and type away for a couple of hours and then fall asleep, no problem. And you could do that over and over and over. And then all of a sudden you start having sleep issues and you don't necessarily attribute it to what you were doing 3 weeks ago because you weren't having any problem sleeping then. So people rationalize it and say, well, I was doing it fine and I was using electronics before, but the changes in the preset neural pathways and the neurotransmitters that are released at that time happens over time. That's an adaptive process. So if you're stimulating dopamine and norepinephrine and you've got this decreased activity of serotonin and GABA, for example, just based on responding to what's happening in the phone. There's pretty good research around this because the people that make the apps have neuroscience in their apps to make people addicted to it, obviously. So that addictive process happens over time. So it starts to become a really big neurochemical problem, weeks in advance, just like if you go and gamble. It might not have a huge impact in your life, but if you do it enough over and over, it could start to become a big problem. And so phones and tablets work that way. And then it can become equally difficult to unwind it once there's a neurochemical pattern that's been established there. So the dangers of it are really, really difficult for people to just sort of sort through with trial and error. I think you have to look at the science, and I think you have to be really respectful of the dangers, like well in advance, even if it's not causing a problem, at this current time.
Yeah, the habit forming in a good way, it works just like the habit forming in a bad way. And I think educating, like I said, I've got teenagers who have their iPhone surgically implanted on their palms all the time. It's a very tricky concept. So I can manipulate, obviously, my own kids. I can shut their phones off with my phone. But what we've been doing with my older daughters when they travel is I do some recovery work with them at the hotel after their game, whether it's some dynamic cool down, some guided meditation, just some recovery movement. We do some vagal nerve breathing, and then we take their devices from them at night. And the panic that was in their eyes when we said, everything was coming, why don't you trust us? And it's like, it's got nothing to do with that. But if you can, we don't do this they don't get to do this every day, but I think we can start to educate and show teenagers and young athletes that they don't need their phone to fall asleep, that they can use some breathing techniques to have confidence, back to that word again, in their nervous systems to fall asleep without being glued to something, and to deal with the thoughts as they come.
100%. And good for you guys for doing that. That's such an important thing for kids because obviously their systems in those developmental stages, it's so critical that they get the right type of sleep and they get the right type of exposure to different forms of stimuli. So I think that's awesome. And I do think that, it can be very easy for parents to give electronics to kids because it can sometimes, free up their time and make life a little bit easier. So I'm glad that there's more awareness and education coming out around that.
Kind of continuing on this train for our parents of young kids, and I'm going to go back to what we had started with, the whole specialization versus generalization. It's a huge topic right now, controversial. I have my opinion on it. But there's a movie or a documentary that I always reference. I always make all my young clients and athletes watch. It's In Search of Greatness. I think it really, the proof is in the pudding. Some of the world's greatest athletes did not specialize and play one sport their entire life. They played their sport because they genuinely loved it. So if they got those 10,000 reps in, it's because they were just finding a way to play. None of this structured, you have to play hockey 365 days a year if you want to make it to the NHL or get a D1 scholarship. You kind of opened the show with it by saying you played 5 different sports. So I'll let you talk a little bit about specialization versus generalization and what you think of the two.
Yeah, sure. There's no question about it that every sport is a little different. So I think you could potentially have this conversation in each sport. So if we're talking about swimming, figure skating, sports where you're doing something that's like really different than what your body is built to do, the volume in those sports does matter, right? It's hard to just, do dry land work and then be a great swimmer, right? And so, but having said that, that's a sport where I do think that the volume does get way out of hand, right? So I think you can probably reverse engineer a really good conversation about where there is too much specialization in almost every sport. But I think that conversation looks differently depending on the sport. One thing I will say about team sports, and quite possibly racket sports and some different sports that have this combination of athleticism with technical work that becomes really, really critical. I think I always look at, like, for hockey players, for example, I always talk about hockey as a decathlon that has all these different tools. And if you go all in on one or two events and just focus on your running and your throwing is not really getting enough attention, your overall point score goes down. Because I really do believe the overall athleticism in that sport is really important. We very often see offensive plays and highlights. We look at stats, but we these sports, whether it's football, basketball, hockey, even baseball to a degree, defense kind of wins at the end of the day. We don't really talk about defense and articulate it or work backwards from the defensive plays to identify the skills that you need athletically to be able to be good at that. So I really do believe in overall athleticism, and I think that's really what gets lost. I think right now as a community, professional community, we're not making great arguments. The arguments are basically just, to me, I think as a community, we make assertions that it's really important not to play your sport that often. It's really important to just train and develop these athletic skills, but really showing and demonstrating some kind of evidence around there is a burden of proof that we have to really undertake and explain why much better. And I've had people say, hey, my athlete is a great hockey player and they're dominating in their sport, but they can't throw a basketball, or they can't, use a hula hoop, or they can't do a jumping jack. And to me, that's not a great explanation. It's like that athlete, as long as they're succeeding in their sport, they're not going to give that up to be able to do something else. And if they are succeeding in their sport, maybe that is actually evidence to the contrary, that playing the sport all the time and not doing these other things really helps you. And there are examples of really, really good athletes who've just done their sport and they've done a lot of it. So I really think what it boils down to are adaptability as an athlete. If you show really, really good athletes over time, not peak performance, but the sustainability of performance through multiple different scenarios and eras, you'll see an athlete that's capable of adapting, capable of changing, modifying what type of style that they have. That's so important. And I think you can demonstrate the importance of that across a lot of sports. And so what that requires is for you to get exposed to all kinds of different levels of stimuli and to be able to mentally and physically problem solve through that adaptation. And I think that is probably the angle that makes the most sense for me in terms of the argument of non-specialization.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. To make you jump on my side for just a little bit, what I am seeing a ton of, I've been practicing 24 years now, is the dramatic increase in repetitive strain injuries in the teenage demographic. So between the ages of 14 to 17, especially, we're seeing a ton more repetitive strain injuries. And, 20 years ago, I don't think I would have put teenager and repetitive strain in the same sentence, because it was just like, why would a young person have repetitive strain? So I do, from a therapeutic standpoint, have a problem with somebody who's just throwing a baseball, and not doing anything else, whether it's on the contralateral side or just different energy system wise. I'm also worried about mental burnout too, and the pressures of just doing one sport over and over and over again. Like, you wouldn't want to eat the same dinner every day, and there are some athletes that, like you said, just genuinely love their sport. That's all they want to do and do very, very well with it. But I think as a community of professionals, we have to do a better job of not being so myopic, right? Like, we want our teenagers and our young athletes to be athletes for life, not just for the next 4 years to get their scholarship or their NHL contract, and then what? So that's the standpoint that I typically have an issue with, is the repetitiveness.
Totally. You make a really good point there too, Kim, because you're kind of, I think underneath all of this is the why behind the specialization. And I think part of the problem is not just that it's a strategy issue. I think part of the problem, and you mentioned injuries, which is a really good point, especially for those athletes that aren't resilient to it. I think there's always going to be some absolutely gifted athletes that come along and defy those rules because they're great compensators or they have great genetics, but that's the very, very small percentage of them. Most of these athletes, these injuries they're crushing and they're demoralizing, and they can have huge traumatic impacts in their life physically and emotionally. But I think one of the things that goes hand in hand with that is this concept of burnout and this concept of the why behind you do something. If you're specializing, that the problem might not be just the specializing. It's like, what's driving that? Is it this push to be involved in the sport for all the wrong reasons? And I think that you're right. The ability to steer away from that is not just about, the strategy in the sport. I think there's a good, selling feature, I think, for the individuals that are so glued to their performance in the sport, and you kind of have to hook them with that same thing. But, it's just the wellness of the individual and the overall state of enjoyment and how critical that part of it is, and learning how to be an athlete who is well-rounded mentally and physically, and why that's so valuable and important.
Yes to all those things. Moving on, again, we're going back to confidence and adaptability. Those seems to be the two big words. Is there something that has taken you a little bit personally, like a longer time, to either learn or adapt to? Or, I mean, you're an extremely open-minded person, but is there anything that that's a lesson that's taken you a little while to learn or sink your teeth into, that looking back on, you're like, geez, I wish I was doing that 20 years ago?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good question. I don't think that there is one thing where I could really just shake my head and say, oh man, I wish I could do that. I think the downside of my style, which is always thinking through things logically and trying to make like really clear arguments around A or B, to build confidence in my understanding of what matters and why. I think the downside of that is you spend a lot of time focused on one or two things. So I can take an exercise application that I have, and I can peel it apart into a million layers fairly well, and rebuild it and know when and where to use it and how to use it and how to modify it in a million different ways. But what happens is I end up getting, in some ways, less tools in my toolbox. And the only reason why I have many is because I've been around for a long time. But things are changing so fast, and there are so many new things happening all the time, whether it's new research that's being published, whether it's new techniques, new concepts, new technology that I need to stay up on. And I'm not a very fast learner, to be quite honest. And I see a lot of these kids who are like colleagues of mine now, or they're people that I'm mentoring or that I'm helping with, and the way that they assimilate information is insane. They can absorb information so fast, and they can adopt new technology and new concepts so quickly. And I'm not really like that. I think that I've always been an advocate and a proponent of the importance of not trying to assimilate too many new things, and to develop a sense of mastery of those things that you are learning. So I've really been encouraging of that. But I think for myself, learning how to work a little bit faster through things and being a little bit more productive with things has been something I've always really been challenged with. And so I think if I could go back in time, it's maybe just forcing myself through things a little bit quicker and trying not to get it perfect all the time.
Right. Is there a certain piece of advice that you've got? I'm going to ask you for one of your favorite quotes in a minute, but is there a piece of advice that you've been given that's made an impact on your career?
I think, yeah, I think probably I've seen this in the form of learning, less about like direct advice per se. But one of the things I picked up on is the intersection between the work that we're doing, whether it's scientific work or whatever it might be, with the real-time important things that matter for the athlete. So whether you're working with a coach, whether you're working with an athlete, it's the ability to make something relevant for them. So you might have a really great application to improve hip mobility or to improve the overall functionality of that joint. but it's helping to be able to identify like where and why that matters, and to be able to articulate that and then show that, that's really, really what matters. So I think that's been like something that's just come up over and over for me. And I think that the best coaches have the ability to make things relevant for people based on where those people are. It's really a way of meeting them where they're at, and showing people why things are relevant. I think that's really important.
That's super interesting. So the going back to Carol McMakin, who's been my mentor throughout this whole process with FSM, when she first asked me to present some of my case studies at the advanced symposium that we have every year, I was a nervous wreck. I'm like, how on earth can I present this to her? She's the guru. What do I have to say? I have nothing to teach. And I had all this really interesting data, and I was really struggling putting it into slides and how to get my point across. And she said, and this is my favorite piece of advice, I want to get it in every room of my house and office, is what you want to say has nothing to do with what they need to hear in order for them to learn. And I keep going back to that all the time, because I think it's important when you are an expert in your field, or you have a lot to say about something. I think we have to be very careful how we package that to our athletes and clients, because again, it's got nothing to do with what I want to say. It's how do I communicate this better so that they get it and they can learn it. And I think, again, going back to the being adaptable as therapists and coaches, how we have to adapt our messages consistently to keep our craft alive and keep these athletes healthy.
So much wisdom in that.
I know, it was great. Okay, time for my favorite part. What's your quote? Is there anything that you like?
Yeah, I mean, I've always kind of been fascinated with the Stoics lately. I've had a few friends that have been into Stoicism and stuff, and there's just always so many great quotes that come from that. But I think the one that is most relevant to our talk here today is people don't care what you know until they know that you care. And I've seen this come up a lot for me. It's actually something I've said 3 or 4 times in the last little while. I think the first person to say it to me was Matt Brown in Calgary, actually. And I remember thinking about this a lot recently, because at the end of the day, building a relationship with somebody and building trust is a prerequisite to then helping them learn and to be able to teach them things. And so one of the things that's really fascinating to me, I was on a group chat with some other leaders in the space, and we were talking about leadership, and somebody asked me about Sidney Crosby, who's known as a great leader, one of the all-time great leaders. And they said, what is it that makes him a great leader? And where my mind went to immediately was, he really cares about people genuinely that he's with. So if he's part of a team, he's probably the most likely on that team to know a lot about the players, to know about their families, their siblings, where they're from, to really create that impression in people that he generally sees them and that they are important to him. And that goes for the staff, that goes for the people that work in the building. He really just takes on that responsibility very organically of showing people that he really cares about them. And I remember, getting into the conversation, and it was like, well, is that technically leadership? Like, what is it about that constitutes leadership? That might even be more closely linked to followership, than leadership. And I thought, yeah, that's probably right. That isn't really a leadership trait yet. I bet you if you were to ask another dozen people who know Sid, and they were asking about leadership, they would probably point to the same thing. So what is it about caring about others that is so potentially closely linked to leadership or effective? And I really just think that we're social beings. We accomplish things in groups and in cohorts, and that's really what we're designed to do. We're not designed to achieve greatness as individuals. We're designed to achieve greatness together. And that ability to trust each other, and that ability to feel connected to others, is part of that. And so I really think that's a great quality. And I think that in order to really be a support person for somebody else, you have to show them that they matter to you, and that you truly care about them, and you care about the result, and that's where your advice is coming from.
Love that. Andy, thank you so much. This like hour flew by, but I feel like we only hit the tip of the iceberg. So maybe we'll have to have you on again and we'll talk about something like very specific, but I just appreciate you, what you're doing, your message. You really are truly just changing so much to do with sport and people and everything. So thank you for your time today.
So cool. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks, Andy. We'll talk to you soon.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.